So hi, everybody. I'm April Taylor. I'm a Chickasaw Nation employee and Chickasaw employee at the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. And I'm basically a tribal liaison for climate change for Oklahoma, New Mexico, Texas, and Louisiana. But the CAS network, we have tribal engagements, tribal liaisons across our entire network. And so we have a lot of capacity and work with tribes. And so today we have some great speakers for you guys. So I'm going to read both bios and then I'll turn it over to them. So we have Rayle Heinzig, is a Choctaw student at OU, currently graduating with her bachelor's in Native American Studies, with an interest in Indigenous ecology and cultural resource management. And she's graduating in a few weeks, so she's looking for opportunities, so if you know of any. And then we have, all right, let me switch here. We have Courtney Hotchkiss, is an assistant researcher at North Carolina State University, where she recently graduated with a doctorate in Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management. And she is a former Global Change Fellow with the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. Her research focuses on meaningful stakeholder engagement, specifically for cultural landscapes at national parks impacted by climate change. And she previously worked for the National Park Service and a state historic preservation officer, and has a master's degree in heritage studies. And so with that, I'll turn it over to them.
Thanks, April. I will share my screen and use Google Slides. So, Rayle, do you want to start? Okay.
Yep. So our slides are going to be covering engagement with tribes on cultural resource and climate change projects. For the beginning, I'm kind of going to go over some more holistic kind of concepts about how tribes and cultural communities might view land stewardship and cultural resources and climate change, how that's impacting them in a slightly different way from maybe the Western management styles. And that's on our next slide here. So I'm going to go over kind of a few things just so that we're all kind of at the same baseline of understanding and moving forward as we discuss these differences between what tribes may view as cultural resources versus natural resources and what maybe more Western organizations do. So land stewardship for tribes often acknowledges that communities and the resources are super connected rather than being two separate issues or resources being a problem that falls underneath the community's issues. So these kind of are one and the same, and they are more heavily impactful for many tribal communities than maybe more Western communities. And then also reciprocity, which is a sense of taking care of the land and then the land taking care of you back, is a very important aspect to understanding cultural resource management for tribes, and a sense of responsibility that might be heavier than some communities that we're maybe familiar with. The cultural resource management directly impacts not only the physical state and the physical look of tribal lands, but also the sense of spiritual understanding, a sense of pride, and a sense of strength in the community. There's a sense of circular interconnectedness that means that the tribe itself and the community itself is directly kind of like that same reciprocal idea, directly impacted by the land, and the land is then directly impacted by the community. The land is a section of the community that is almost like a person for many tribes, or a family member that it's not an option to take care of or to not take care of. It's this directly connected idea and concept. There's an acknowledgement of the impact of the land on us, but there's less rigid boundaries between the natural and unnatural. So instead of like a tree being directly, like, we acknowledge kind of, especially in ecological studies, like that is a a natural object, but it's not necessarily living in the same way that humans are living, there's much less rigid boundaries whenever we discuss natural and cultural resources in the same way. And then I think my next slide, that this is kind of going over that concept of these areas are directly connected. So cultural resources and natural resources, especially for tribes, are often one and the same. So you're not going to see a direct separation like we see with a lot of programs in more Western focused services. And they are directly impacted by each other. So sweetgrass management, culturally significant plant management, and water. Like water, we may think of as only a natural resource oftentimes, but for many tribes, it is also a cultural resource. It has legends attached to it. It's a living being or a spiritual center. The tribe may have certain activities or like celebrations that are specifically focused around taking care of their natural resources, therefore imbuing them with a sense of cultural importance as well. For example, if we look at sweetgrass management, we're talking about the stewardship of a grass type that is the process of taking care of the sweetgrass and harvesting it is in itself a cultural activity and has specific parameters and specific ways of doing so in order to imbue it with like this spiritual sense of like pride, even though from an outside view, it may just look like taking care of a natural resource in a fairly regular way. Climate change also does affect many aspects of these cultural resources, plants and animals, and those cultural processes. If we look at sage management and how fall springs have been affecting the amount of sage that's growing in the wild. We're looking at different animals that have been affected by climate change in the natural landscapes and how those populations are declining. These are all things that are natural resources that are impacted by climate change, but because of their connectedness to cultural resources are also directly impacting that relationship. And I'm going to throw it over to Courtney now.
Great, thanks very much, Rayle. That was a great overview and then relation to between Western science and tribal ways of knowing and perspective. So thanks for setting me up for my example. I'll be talking about some of the research that my team did and some I did for my dissertation. So this is coming from my perspective as a non-Indigenous, non-tribal citizen. But we did our team did a lot of great work all over the country. We learned a lot, and I'm really excited to share some of this with you today. And our team started actually with a prioritization framework for historic buildings and structures impacted by climate change. You can see here, there's an example. This was spearheaded by Erin Seekamp, who's on the call too, and for this research. And they came up with the OptiPres model. And you can see this is just a little glimpse of it. And I recommend that you have a look at this publication from it. And from that, they did a pilot project at Cape Lookout National Seashore. And after that, Park Service wanted to focus on archaeological resources as a different resource type. And I know Marcy's on the call too, so I hope she chimes in at some point too to talk more about the beginning of this prioritization framework for how to focus on archaeological sites. And this was broken down when we're looking at how to prioritize sites into site vulnerability, which is made up of sensitivity and exposure, and site significance, which is mainly what my focus was and what I'll be talking about today, how we determine site significance. And this is a very early version of the framework, this cultural resource value. This came through a series of workshops with National Park Service staff. And you can see there's a list of attributes. These also have sub-attributes and metrics, and everything's weighted. And it's this attribute here, association, where communities, tribal nations, their values and perspectives are assessed and added to this framework. So it's a very small percentage of the framework, of the final score for these sites. You can see how this is an issue, especially because a lot of archaeology sites are the cultural patrimony of associated tribal nations and communities. So this became very clear that this framework, this prioritization framework, was very National Park Service focused on their values and perspectives, and that there is a lot of Western bias and in the framework as it is. I mean, National Park Service employees want to use data that's already available. So this makes sense if you've ever used like the CRIS database or other previous databases. These attributes and sub-attributes come from that data that's already available. But when we started to talk to tribal nations, they said prioritization and determining relative site significance is actually harmful to them. And this doesn't really reflect their values and perspectives. And so you've probably seen these two documents before, policy memo 1402 from National Park Service, or this memo from the executive office calling on the integration of to include indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, or ITEC, in decision-making about not just cultural resources, but also within federal decision-making. So these are two awesome movements towards including different ways of knowing and perspectives into public land management and federal decision-making. And we do have mechanisms for that. We have mandated consultation. However, mandated consultation and some of these memos don't necessarily, what we're seeing is they don't necessarily value ITEC in the way that they value Western science. So I'll talk more about this, but there is a movement, not just in the US, but internationally, to include indigenous and traditional ways of knowing and perspectives. So our focus, my focus for my research too, especially, was how do we weave together Western science and indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, ITEC, to best take care of archaeological sites and traditional use areas at national parks. And this can go beyond towards other public lands. And I use the word traditional use areas here as an example of something very early on that we heard from tribes, was that the term archaeology site itself, it indicates that a site is from the past and that we're just extracting information from it. When that's not necessarily true. These are actively used sites by living groups of people today. So they asked us to use it, to also include this term traditional use areas. And I'll talk a little bit more about terms and terminology and the values embedded in the terms that we use. And I have this example here of Knife River Indian Village's National Historic Site in North Dakota. And they came up with an archaeological resource management plan with the MHA Nation, their associated tribal, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation. And this is a really wonderful example of Park Service and the associated nation working together to come up with this plan. So I really recommend it. I got to go there and talk to the superintendent, who is now, the superintendent now is a member of the nation. And so really, if you get a chance, this is a good example within Park Service of that collaboration. So what our team did was to use a multimodal approach to get as many voices and perspectives and to talk to as many people as we could. And we held workshops. I did a couple of trainings on tribal perspectives for climate change adaptation planning. We had some listening sessions, also at conferences. We looked at different documents and policies and laws for terms and terminology, and how they're embedded in Western science, Western values. We did site visits. We had regular meetings with our tribal partners. And particularly one that I'll talk about. And we were also able to support some tribal interns as part of this research. So this was also important because not all tribal nations and communities have the same values and perspectives. So we wanted to really just talk to as many people as we could. And I'll talk about one example, one pilot study we did at Glacier, what's now Glacier National Park, which is also the ancestral homelands of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, Blackfeet Nation, and the Pandare. And I have a couple pictures here. The one on the right of the tree is a culturally modified tree. And this is a really good example for our team, and I think for other archaeologists and anthropologists, about what we consider to be an archaeology site, right? This is a living organism, but also an archaeology site, right? You can see with the hatch marks there where it was cut and the bark was peeled off and used, and how the tree has grown around it. So we can see the movement of people and camps in that area. But planning for that, and especially for climate change impacts, it is a little bit different. So that was one example that we faced in this pilot study. So we got to go out in the field with some Park Service archaeologists and cultural resource specialists. And also we went out in the field with a tribal intern, Jay Bird, he's here on the left. And it was really amazing to be out there looking at the landscape with him, and him telling us his perspective and what his values are, and what the landscape is used for, in a protected way. But it was also really a highlight of, in my discipline, but also of my life, to go out there and to see it from his eyes, right? So it was really a wonderful experience, and I think it was really important for others to go out into the landscape together. Some of our other collaborators on this project, Mike Derglow from Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribe, really was our main partner. And we worked with Sierra Mandelko, who is a Park Service archaeologist. Camille Whiteman and Awani Williams are interns, and then Jay Bird, Eleanor Knight, and Michael Kraus. So some of the lessons from this pilot study, we also had 3 workshops with tribal elders, and we tested the framework as it was at that time. And some really important things that I'd like to share from these workshops from my perspective were, everyone mentioned a landscape approach. You can't separate, as Rayle also said, you can't separate culture and nature, right? That also goes to non-human beings, is that everything we have these artificial boundaries of sites, we have the artificial boundary of the park, and that's not the way, from a tribal perspective, to really look at and understand the story of the landscape. Also, they asked a lot for access to sites. They're, as I mentioned, actively used sites, important places to them. So harvesting, going to visit them is very important, especially because they've been removed for a while. We also had a lot of conversations about loss, right? And from a Western science perspective, we don't necessarily want to lose things. We want to protect and preserve. We don't necessarily want to neglect them, but also some loss is okay. And I think that is some shifting in thinking that needs to happen, especially with climate change. A lot of tribal citizens were concerned with visitors and visitation through the sharing of information of sites on social media, and also that climate change impacts will influence where visitors go. We definitely saw this at Glacier because it's getting hotter in the summertime. There's more extremes. People are looking for water. So now they're going to lakes that were once remote, and now they're getting more visitation. Sites are being exposed more often from climate change impacts. So it's something that Park Service and land resource managers need to be aware of. Also, again, this framework only represents Park Service values. And is that okay? Is the framework still useful in starting a conversation, or is it not useful at all, right? To just have the Park Service perspective of these prioritization of the different archaeological sites. I also did some interviews with Park Service staff all over the country. And I coded the interviews for best practices. And I think this is interesting to share. But I asked, what are some examples of things that worked for collaboration with tribal nations? And unsurprisingly, relationship building and valuing ITech were at the top, most frequently mentioned. Having informal engagement, just picking up the phone, having a meal together, which also, I guess, goes towards relationship building, collaborating, inviting tribal nations from the beginning of the planning process. Relearning and learning was also something that people mentioned, which I'll mention again. Listening, continued communication, creating dynamic plans versus static plans, and finding opportunities for sharing power. These are some of the top mentioned best practices. And from this work too, we also came up with strategies for meaningful engagement. You can read more at this from this publication here, the Park Stewardship Forum. But what we learned from our research, from our experiences, from talking to tribes, it's important to hold regular meetings, to create opportunities for co-management, to share information, which kind of goes with the next point of providing access to places, but also access to information, right? Parks have a lot of archives, catalogs, databases. Like I mentioned, tribal nations, tribal citizens have been removed from the landscape for a long time, and things have been collected and documented. So I think sharing that information and what's been collected is really important for making decisions together about how to protect or steward these places. Fostering data sovereignty for tribes, creating site-specific plans and responses, going beyond downscaling, but also really looking at the landscape, and then taking a landscape approach and understanding the landscape together. Some implications of this research, as project and the greater project, is this need to decolonize archaeology, and so that ITech can be accepted and elevated and valued as Western sciences. Another implication is this, also really mentioned, this is focus on holistic site stewardship to rehumanize the landscape and to break down these artificial silos, not just between culture and nature, but the departments and the funding streams that go for that, and the boundaries, identifying those and understanding how they can take away from holistic site stewardship. My last slide, some recommendations from our team: find opportunities for co-management, update policies to reflect tribal sovereignty, which means putting less emphasis on the National Register, finding ways for process versus using criteria, right? It's fostering conversations and relationship building. Changing qualifications to practice archaeology, updating curricula so it's not just from a Western perspective. And then, like I mentioned before, having integrated resource management. We all know that natural resources tends to get more funding than cultural resources. So working together and also changing that funding to relationship building and collaborating with tribal nations. So I'll pass it back over to Rayle.
She mentioned a lot of the points that are kind of in the last slide here, but just to reiterate, some of the most important things to continuously keep in mind when we're looking at management approaches with tribes is that it's community driven. These are their sites of importance and their cultural resources. It's important for us to focus on doing what they want to do. If that means they want to protect a landscape that maybe the archaeologists or scientists think is less important than another, then that means that site is more important. There are reasons that don't have to be shared amongst a lot of professionals by tribes in order to know that the site is important, and that we need to base the kind of plan for the future around that site or resource. Also respect as far as the knowledge of an elder or a tribal government official, acknowledging that someone's ways of knowing might not be validated by a degree or a title, but still have the same level of importance as somebody with like a doctorate degree. The development of relationships and trust, not only to understand the issue, but also to understand the tribe and its relationship with its resources is really important. And also just a sense of positionality and reciprocity as core values. When we're talking about the tribe may give you access to knowledge that's traditional about this area in order to help you understand its importance. But that also means you have a sense of reciprocity as far as giving back to them and representing their values and interests. And positionality in the form of like understanding the perspective you're coming from and how it might be different from the perspective that they're coming from. But yeah, I think that's actually our last, we have our thank you slide. And that's it. And we're open for questions.